Father, we thank you for this chance to gather together to help with our town and the things that are needed. We thank you for our military and our first responders and their willingness to serve. We ask you, Father, that you keep us mindful of the true meaning of this season of giving and giving, but there is a little bit more to it, and that was the giving of your Son. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Noble, Councilmember Cummings,
Here.
Councilmember Roberts, Vice Mayor Zemitis, Mayor Howell.
Present. Okay, we're going to open with public comment, but before we do that, I don't know how many people were in the audience were at the tree lighting ceremony this weekend, but what a successful event that we had. Anna and her family were there, and they worked. It was unbelievable. Her husband cooked all the hot dogs and everything. Her daughter gave popcorn. Ken, where's he at? Ken back there, he needs a standing ovation for what he did. I'm telling you. He did a quality job, let me tell you. And the council, everybody pitched in. And I don't know who played Santa Claus, but they did a pretty good job of it, whoever did it, so.
Some chubby guy.
Some chubby guy, okay. I want to open it up to public comment, and if it's going to be discussed later on, you know, now is not the time to say anything. When we get to the discussion, probably why a lot of you people are here, that's when we will talk about it. Public comment is for anything that is not on the agenda. Do we have anybody who would like to make a public comment tonight?
And please, just as a reminder, when you come up here, there's a form for you to fill out with your name and address. We'd appreciate you filling that out as well. Thank you.
And you have 3 minutes, and if you go over 3 minutes, I got this.
My name is Robert. Last name is Harrison, A-R-R-I-S-O-N. I live at 6048 45th Avenue North. I just wanted to know if there's anything the council and the city can do about improving the mail service in Kenneth City. Some days we don't get the mail till 8 o'clock at night. Some days we get it at noon. It seems like we don't have a regular route. We're like an overflow, and they're working the route on overtime. But it sure be nice to get our mail at a reasonable time, because you have no idea on any given day if it's going to come or not.
I understand. I got mine the other day at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
So, but I would have to check with our attorney and town manager, but I don't think there's anything that we can do about the mail delivery service.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else? All right, at this time, I'd like to close public comment and move to the presentation from Forward Pinellas. Are you going to handle that?
Yes.
Well, step on that.
Just give me a hand first.
Well, good evening, everyone. I think a good number of you might have been here for our November 3rd meeting, where myself and Rodney presented regarding amendments to Chapter 54, which is concerning the parking of recreational vehicles or just traffic and parking in general. So I'll let Pete pull up the presentation, but essentially today we are here to tell you about the results of our research. If you recall, a number of you might have participated in a survey, whether that was online or a hard copy. We'll talk more about those results, and ultimately we will talk about the recommendations that we have for this particular chapter. Thank you, Pete. If you can go on to the next slide. You can go on to the next slide as well. So just to provide an overview of the project scope, this consisted of 4 main elements. The first one, which you're familiar with, was the resident survey, because we wanted to hear from you what your thoughts were on parking recreational vehicles, and also hear your thoughts on violations or penalties that might come as a result of those. And I'll go over those results later on, as I mentioned. We also looked at the local conditions of Kenneth City because it's important for us to know what is on the ground. So we looked at the average age of single-family homes around the town, the widths of roadways, and also the lengths of driveways. We also did a comparative analysis of other communities' RV parking standards to really understand what's going on around the county. And ultimately, this led to a deliverable of a summary report. And within that report, we provided options for code amendments based on all of these findings. So based on the resident survey, the local conditions analysis, and also council feedback, and including the resident feedback that we received at the November 3rd meeting. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly go over some of those elements, starting with the local conditions analysis. And again, this was to understand what is on the ground in the town, right? Because we can't necessarily make any recommendations without being grounded in physical reality as to what your community looks like. So we actually drove around the town a couple of times and also looked at the data that the property appraiser's office and our mapping data that we have, and we found that driveway lengths in your town are typically 40 feet. Roadway widths range from 19 to 25 feet, and or 26 feet. My apologies. And really what that tells us is that the spacing for parking vehicles is sparse, but that's not anything that I have to remind you all of. I'm sure you're all aware, but these numbers just sort of quantify to us what's possible for our recommendations. As I mentioned, we looked at the average year built of single family homes, and what that does in looking at that, we're able to look at sort of the design standards that were common for a certain decade and understand why certain driveways were built a certain way, or why the distance between certain plots are a certain way. And what we found is that the average year built of single family homes is in 1961. But when we came around the second time to your town and drove around, we saw that there were very distinct neighborhoods and roads that had, very common types of homes. And what that told us is that looking at the average might not necessarily be the most accurate depiction of what's going on around the community, but maybe looking at the most common decade built of homes in your community is more accurate. So we looked at pretty much all the data we had for all the homes in Kenneth City and found out the mode or the most common decade built, and we found that it was in the 1950s. So what that showed us sort of matched with what we saw on the ground, which was that a lot of homes in this community have single car driveways and basically really narrow roadways surrounding them. The next element that we looked at was the comparative analysis, and before I talk about these results, this comparative analysis is not to compare Kenneth City to another jurisdiction in Pinellas County. Every community in Pinellas County is so different from one another, we can't exactly compare it like apples to apples. For us, it was really just to understand what other jurisdictions are doing as examples. With that, one of the things that came up at the town council meeting was the question of whether the size limitations of RVs includes any trailers that are required to mount them or hitch them. And so we looked at what other local governments were doing with those standards. And the size limitations for recreational vehicles in other local governments ranged from anywhere from 22 feet to 40 feet, which is a pretty big range when you think about a vehicle. But every single one of those local governments included the trailers or mounts that were required to park them. And your code currently does that as well, so that just tells us that everyone is sort of doing the same industry practice. As for the actual parking of those vehicles, these regulations range widely depending on the community, and again, each community is sort of just doing what's best for their physical built environment, but those regulations included some of the following examples, which prohibited grass parking of recreational vehicles entirely. Some allow parking on front, side, or rear yards as long as that recreational vehicle fit that size limitation. Some just talked about prohibiting parking in the public right-of-way, alley, or other public areas. And some prohibit the parking of recreational vehicles in the case that it displaces domestic vehicles. So if your everyday car is being displaced as a result of your recreational vehicle, that was something that they prevented. And I know that was something, for those of you who were here at the November 3rd meeting, is something that you all talked about a lot, that in the case that a home had a recreational vehicle, it ended up displacing, the 4 cars that family had onto the roadway. So that was something that other codes also considered. So moving on to the survey feedback, we asked you a number of questions and I'll be going over some of the main ones. First thing we wanted to understand, well, I should say first, we received exactly 300 responses, which is very strange that we received such like a clean, even number, but that made the analysis a little bit easier. But with that being said, not all 300 of those responses were complete. So some people sort of skipped some questions, which was totally okay. Those were optional. But, you know, when you're looking at these pie charts, if any of you are good at quick maths, you find that it's not adding up to 300, that would be why there might be some questions that were missing some answers. So we wanted to first understand who in the community owns a boat, RV, or other similar recreational vehicle, and the vast majority of you said that you do not. But in some of those comments, some of you said that you're thinking about it, and it might be that understanding the code or the regulations is why you haven't done it yet. So that was something I wanted to clarify as well. Next slide, please. Then we asked you what your opinion on parking a recreational vehicle on the grass in a residential area is, and we got pretty much a split response. So 85 of you said you strongly approve, while 28% or 28 of you said that you slightly approve. But then on the flip side, 106 of you said that you strongly disapprove, and 27 of you said that you slightly disapprove. So pretty much when you add those numbers up, it's pretty much a split camp, with some people being neutral. And then with regard to, it's okay, you can go on to the next slide. No, I appreciate it. So we also wanted to ask you your thoughts on penalties, because Rodney will talk about it later on, but a lot of the goal of this amendment is to make a code that's enforceable, and with enforcement comes the option of penalties. It's not necessarily a requirement, but an option. So we wanted to get your thoughts on that as well. And same thing here, if you look at it, the area of red and the orange and the green area, it was really split among those of you who said you strongly disapprove or slightly disapprove, and on the other camp that said that they're in the camp of approval for financial penalties. Next slide, please. And then we also asked you a more open-ended question as to how you would prefer recreational vehicles be parked in your community. And if you recall, when you answered this question, you had the option to check multiple responses because we wanted to sort of get everyone's thoughts and allow people a spectrum of answers to give. And 118 of you said that any recreational vehicles that are parked in residential areas should be parked only on the driveway and not on the grass. But then a number of you gave a combination of other answers saying that, they can be parked on the roadway as long as they're not blocking driveways or deterring the right of way. Some of you said that there should not be any recreational vehicles parked in residential areas at all. And some of you said that you do agree that recreational vehicles should be parked on grass. So next slide, please. What that essentially told us is that there is a split in this town on whether, on the opinion of recreational vehicles, and that was good for us to know, because after, the survey was still open at the time that we came here on November 3rd. And at the time, those results pretty much looked the exact same, just with smaller numbers. It was split the entire way through. Like, consistently, we had, as soon as someone answered that they strongly approve, another person came and said that they strongly disapprove, and it just stayed even throughout. And so this is where I kind of want to talk to you about the feedback that we received from the November 3rd meeting. And one of probably the most significant comments we received that we took into account was to avoid broad brush regulations and to not just paint the town with one single code without consideration for the differences in the different communities within Kenneth City. And those survey results sort of reinforce that to us, right? Because we have such split opinions on it. And also, driving around Kenneth City itself, it showed us that those broad brush regulations aren't going to be effective in the case of your town. We also got some questions about whether there could be a public parking lot within the town for RV parking, so we looked into that. We spoke to Pete and Randy about it, and essentially we found that the cost of maintaining it ultimately is not something that's feasible for the town currently, right? Even if there might be space, creating a lot is one thing, but maintaining it and that upkeep is another, and that might create other problems in the long run that might just bring us all back here. A number of you during the council meeting and also probably emailed Pete about it, asked about concerns about RV parking and property values. And so we looked into that. We asked the property appraiser's office their thoughts on it and whether there was anything quantifiable or statistical that could tell us one way or another. And the response we received was basically that there isn't anything that concretely proves that RV parking in neighborhoods brings down property values. There's never really been a study that's been conducted, or even if there has, it's never yielded any concrete results. But with that being said, the professional opinion of the property appraiser staff was that perception is still something to consider. And in his experience, RVs being parked in the neighborhood might deter some, potential buyers, but that's also not concrete, right? That's just one person's opinion, but I guess that's just to say that perception is a lot of what's at play here, and I think that also just reinforces sort of split opinions, even amongst yourselves. And lastly, when we concluded the meeting, one of the biggest takeaways we also had is that, the council and yourselves, you all want a clearly readable code and something that's enforceable. And something that I want to reiterate in this case is that, the whole purpose of a code is not to look for reasons to punish people or reasons to penalize people. It's really just to bring people into compliance so that your community looks the way that you want it to, it feels the way you want it to in terms of safety and just the atmosphere of the community that you want. And so our goal and the recommendations that we're going to review with you tonight is to essentially make that happen, create a code, or give you options to create a code that is enforceable, not for the purpose of penalizing, but just for the purpose of bringing these things into compliance. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rodney, who will talk to you about those recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Nasheen, Rodney Chapman, Planning Division Manager here at Fort Pinellas. I will spend the next few minutes giving you an overview of the recommendations that we have developed thus far. Again, based on the survey, the meeting feedback we heard during the third work session, our competitive analysis and other factors, just our professional opinion and experience doing this kind of work. The reality is, you didn't give us an easy assignment because quite honestly, if the survey had been clear majorities on one side or the other, it made our work a lot easier. But as Nasheen discussed, there was a general split in the survey respondents' feedback. And so what we have to do as planners in looking at potential amendments to code, we try to balance a lot of things. And so as you look at chapter 54 and what could be done to meet the objectives that were voiced by the residents and the councilors on November 3rd, we had to look at things, not only the survey, but also the sizes of your residential lots, because some areas of your town, particularly those areas zoned RS 5.0, have a bigger buildable area, if you will, than those that are zoned RS 7.5, which are some of the smaller lots in older areas of town. We also had determined that your current driveway width standards in chapter 50 or in your code are less than what's allowed in most other Pinellas communities, which again constrains your ability to park recreational vehicles on a paved surface. As Nasheen also talked about, we did look at the sizes that are allowed in other communities for recreational vehicles and found that your range your 30-foot limitation was within the range that's allowed. And again, as you mentioned, these regulations are unique to each community. And so while we weren't looking to compare you to another community, we wanted to see, were you an outlier one way or the other? But what we found is that you're pretty much almost in the middle of a 22-foot to a 40-foot maximum as other communities have in the regulation. And then lastly, one of the things we hadn't really seen before in this kind of work is that your code enforcement or code compliance mechanism is actually through law enforcement. And typically that is not what we see. We typically see that through a town administration or a planning or building department.
Please,
Yeah.
last week we did change that. We do have a code enforcement officer in town hall.
Yes, and the lead up to this meeting with, you guys tonight, we did, learn, from Pete that he was a bit ahead of us and, did, hire a code enforcement, position. So that does help deal with one of the things that we saw back in November 3rd as something to take a closer look at. Next slide. So what we'll talk about, going forward is a few options for the council's consideration. Again, we didn't feel that there was a strong public sentiment one way or the other. So what we're going to talk about tonight is essentially some tweaks to your code, because we're trying to strike a balance of a lot of different factors and interests, and presented these few options for you tonight. So option one is to essentially make no changes to the current RV parking regulations. Continue to prohibit grass parking or recreational vehicles in residential areas as you do currently. However, in looking at Article 4, which is your driveway and median opening regulations, we did see that those standards that currently limit you to 20 feet of driveway width are a bit less than what is allowed generally in other communities in Pinellas County. And so we would recommend you increasing that to 24 feet. We also think there would be a corollary increase in the driveway width for duplexes. We are finding that housing type is becoming more common here in Pinellas County, and given the nature of the construction that is occurring to date, a little bit more driveway width is appropriate. And then lastly, we also would propose to reduce the side setback for driveways from the current standard of 5 feet down to 3 feet. That is more in line with what we have seen in other communities around Pinellas County. And the reason we looked at modifying those driveway standards is because you're again going to continue to prohibit RV parking under this scenario, but you're giving the residents a little bit more area in order to do that. So you're saying we're going to hold you to this current standard, but we're giving you a little, essentially for about 6 more feet of width to keep that RV on a paved surface. And I would also add that these aren't in isolation. You can almost look at this as an a la carte approach. So you can perhaps, if you choose so, to pick and choose different elements of these options as you see fit. Next slide. Option 2 would be what we're calling a minor change to the current RV parking regulations, where you continue to prohibit the parking of recreational vehicles in residential areas, but you would amend the definition of a driveway to include turf block as an approved construction material type. What this does is allows for you to continue to have a stabilized paved, essentially stabilized paved, if you will, surface for the recreational vehicle parking, but turf block has been used in a lot of other communities to provide a visually attractive alternative while also reducing your stormwater impacts, because the turf block serves as a means to allow rainwater to infiltrate into the ground aquifer. It also has ancillary benefits in terms of filtering pollution, and if done properly, can also be a nice aesthetic feature that can withstand foot and vehicular traffic. And you see 2 examples of turf block here on the slide, where the top example is a completely turf block driveway with pavers on either edge as a border. And then the second image, the bottom, is probably more in line with perhaps what you would see here in Kenneth City, where you have somebody give them the ability to take an existing concrete driveway and then put another 2 or 3 feet of turf block on the side to again expand that paved surface, if you will, for parking recreational vehicles. Next slide. And then option 3 would be what we consider a major change to your regulations, where you would permit the grass parking of recreational vehicles by removing all those prohibitions that are existing in Chapter 54. But we felt that there's a lot of value in the turf block options, so we would also have you consider amending that definition of the driveway to include the turf block again as an approved construction material type for driveways. Next slide. So, although this was not necessarily clearly identified in our scope, after November 3rd, we had some internal discussions about a lot of things that we heard that night. And one of the things that came across very loud and clear to us was the enforcement mechanism or enforcement process for code violations. And so what you will find in chapter 54 is that these are considered non-criminal violations, and residents can be assessed civil penalties and fines. And each day you are in non-compliance and is considered a separate offense. And the code talks about law enforcement being able to issue a parking ticket, and there's a whole sort of judicial process that goes along with that. That's one approach that we don't often see in our work. And so we put our heads together and tried to present to you a few other strategies for what we would consider, probably more effective code compliance. And again, as Pete mentioned before, the town has already gone ahead and hired that code enforcement officer. But we would also think that you should have some additional attention to how that code enforcement officer would operate under the existing civil penalty regime. Most other communities, quite honestly, have a different approach. They either have a code enforcement board or a special magistrate. Code enforcement board is a board of appointed citizens that meets on a regular basis to consider cases where there is a violation of city codes and standards. In your smaller communities, like Kenneth City, quite honestly, you don't see those very often because there is sometimes a challenge in getting residents to want to volunteer for these boards where you don't get compensated for your time. So in those instances, in your smaller communities, we see what is called a special magistrate. That is essentially an attorney that serves the same function as the code enforcement board. So they'll meet on a regular basis and hear cases brought forth by the code enforcement officer and render a decision. And I guess the last bullet is sort of our editorial comment about just code enforcement in general, because for me personally, I cut my teeth as a planner working with the two code enforcement officers that worked for the city that I worked in. And so for the first 3 or 4 years, I did a lot of code interpretation and working with citizens to bring them to compliance. And that's sort of my professional outlook on code enforcement. Is really about compliance and not punishment. And so by having a code enforcement officer at either a board or a special magistrate, there can be many steps that are taken before a property owner is brought in front of the board or the special magistrate. Typically in the processes that I'm familiar with, you would have a scenario where the code enforcement officer will meet with the resident to notify them of a non-compliant situation, and then set a date, let's say 30 or 45 days in the future, to come back and re-inspect. So let's say you have this violation, code enforcement officer lets you know that you have 30 or 45 days to come into compliance. The officer comes back. If you're in compliance, everybody's happy. There's been no escalation of the case into a magistrate or a board. If there is not compliance, then after that 30 or 45 day period, the case is then scheduled for that code enforcement board or special magistrate meeting. So it's a more nuanced process. If you had a board or a magistrate, as opposed to, I believe what you have now currently, which is you're sort of guilty and go to the court and be fined. In my career, it's been more of a relationship and a dialogue with residents to bring them to compliance, because honestly, I found that sometimes residents just don't know what the rules are, and once they're notified, then they oftentimes will come into compliance. And then lastly, one of the things that we also think, regardless of what you do, that there should be the creation of some what we call a one-page or an information sheet about the RV parking standards in residential areas. Because when we were here on November 3rd, there were a lot of questions and confusion about what the standards are, how do you measure this or that. And then looking at chapter 54, we found that all the answers are in there. But perhaps there's a way to condense that information down and put it on a one-page fact sheet that is made available in the building department or on your city's website, just so that everyone is clear what the standards are and there is a lesson confusion. Next slide. So with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Can we open this up for public comment this time?
It's at your discretion. That's at your discretion, Mayor. You could start with the commissioner, open the public.
I would rather that they were able to ask the gentleman questions as we proceed. Go ahead, sir.
You just state your name and address in the.
Good evening, Tim Shelby, 4702 Lake Charles Drive North. Two questions I have. In your presentation, you didn't mention, was there any recommendations for any length or width of an RV? And also, could you further define what you mean by step back?
Thank you.
As I mentioned in our remarks, we did essentially, we took a look at other codes and standards from other communities around Pinellas County to determine if the Kenneth City 30-foot limitation was an outlier within the realm of how RV sizes are regulated. And what we found was no, that 30-foot limitation is pretty much in the middle of what other communities are doing. Some limit them to as small as 22 feet in length, others go all the way up to 40 feet in length. We did not find any community that regulated the width of an RV. Second question dealt with setbacks. A setback is a distance that is required to be maintained for structures or driveways. So, for example, every piece of property here in every town in America has a setback of some sort, meaning a distance that you have to maintain from the property line to the front of the structure, or in this case, to the edge of a driveway. And it's done to do a couple things. One, it helps limit the amount of impervious surface on a piece of property, so you can't, pave the entire thing. And also, it allows for you to have a degree of separation between physical features, your neighbors, so on.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? About council, does anyone have a question at this point?
Yes, I do.
So unlike you.
When you did the drive-through, she said you went through twice. Did you drive through at night or was it just during the day?
Only during the day.
Mike Gross, 5547 40th Ave. Do you need me to go up there or?
If you could, please.
Okay, I can do that. When I bought my house in 2019, there's already a document on Kenneth City's website for residential parking options resulting from code enforcement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that document or not. It covers years homes were built, everything that you pretty much covered in your presentation as far as the driveway sizes, and things like that. It has the options already in there for paving, no parking on grass, options for the resident for widening their driveway. I spoke to a lot of residents, they're not even aware that that's even on the website or available for reference. So was that taken into consideration with the?
We're not aware of that.
Okay, all right, so a lot of the information that you found was already right there. The setback I agree with, that's safety concerns, pulling out of your driveway, blocking sidewalks, and things like that. Also on the count, I noticed that the count of people that actually owned RVs and boats was like at 30 on the survey, but the response to side with the boats and RVs was 50%. So those numbers are kind of those opposed to parking boats and RVs in certain places. So that tells me that a lot of the residents are on board with people that have boats and RVs that don't have boats and RVs. So take that into consideration, the percentage. And then the survey that was taken, I took it online. how many times can you take that survey online?
Once.
And once? From, what limited that to you once? Your ID?
It was set up so that the respondent could respond only once, like there's settings that, because when you put in your information, it can only take once.
But someone that didn't live in Kenneth City could go in there and take the survey 3 times, use a different address?
Technically, but I totally doubt that situation happened.
But that involves a lot of surveys, so I wanna make sure that the information's not skewed in any way.
There was no evidence that that would have happened,
Okay.
but it was only publicized to Kenneth council members.
Okay, and then when you were driving around, I know I've also spoken to a lot of people, there's not really a clear, it's obvious to me the clear line between Leoman and Kenneth City when you come down 46. Did you know when you were driving around if you were on a Leoman Street or on a Kenneth City Street? I just wanna verify that,
Yes.
because that's night and day, as far as boats and RVs, so, okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Excuse me, sir. Pardon me.
Albert Vaughton,
Can you turn
6116 Second Avenue
your
North.
address for your and
5547.
My question is, as far as.
45th
age,
Avenue.
We have
Got
a
it.
length
Mike,
that
Brooks.
you go with, obviously it can't be more than, 96 or 102 inches wide. But as far as age, one man's treasure is another man's junk, so I have a 45-year-old RV with flat tires, I'm taking that into consideration as far as property values.
Oh, in terms of property values,
You said that there was no discernible as far as property values go.
they are, and when we talked to the deputy director of appraisals for the property appraisals office, and what he said was, there's no, metric that they use to appraise property that has to deal with RV parking in your residential area.
But a shiny new RV obviously is more attractive than a broken down rat infested one, correct?
That's correct.
So that's something that we have to take into consideration, correct?
We did talk to the attorney about, typically, we see what is called inoperable vehicles, standards and local codes, and, Randy did talk to us about that provision being in the code, so.
Like a boat, the motor doesn't work, but the boat still floats, so how do you judge that operability there?
I'll have to refer to the attorney on that.
Randy, you're available 24/7 to answer these questions, correct?
No, sir, I'm not.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely not.
Are you still gonna open it up to comment?
It's being used interchangeably at this point, so feel free to approach the microphone, sir.
Rose Roberts, 6026 44th Avenue North. My question is there a side that a boat or RV can be parked on? Are they supposed to park near their driveway, or they can park near their bedrooms?
The code does not specify that, so they can park it wherever they would like, as long as it's on the paved driveway.
And there's presently a provision in the code for recreational vehicles to be in a side lot. If they're behind a fence, which side of your house would really depend on the dimensions of your own property, or a property for that matter. So there's not well, if it's on the side of the master bedroom versus the kitchen, we don't get into that sort of regulation.
The thing is it's not a master bedroom, it's in a area with people living next door, like backing up the driveway.
Understood.
No. Randy, does it have to be behind a fence when you put it on the side of your home?
I believe presently, if it can fit fully on the side, there was a provision about fencing. I can't say that unequivocally because, quite frankly, it's a very involved chapter and there's nuances based on the way it was done. It can be here, if not there, if not there, if not. It's sort of an if-then decision tree to the location. So I'm not going to unequivocally say it has to be behind a fence off the top of my head.
Just behind the front of the home?
And as a reminder, in this workshop, we're not just talking about what it is, but the directions it could go. So that's, this gentleman has a comment.
Yeah, this is not a question, more of a comment. So Ken Nielsen, 5921 46th Avenue, I'm the second house down right here on the side street of 46. I do own an RV and I do own a boat. Both of them are over 30 feet. And the boat is near 42 feet once it's on the trailer, the tongue of the trailer and motors and whatnot, and the RV is 36 feet. I store them at a location storage lot in Largo, but I do bring them home to load it. Going on a trip tomorrow morning, it's in front of my house right now. To load it, I do work on them. Both, like an RV, you have to work on it. My driveway is 32 feet. Plus the house overhang, I have 30 feet to work with. Neither of them fit the driveway perpendicular to the home. One of the stipulations of the code. I do put the boat and I do put the RV in the driveway at an angle. Wheels, everything is on the driveway. I do overhang my grass. My comment out of all of this is when the code came out last year, I was stunned to see that. I've had a boat in my driveway and actually rebuilt my boat in my driveway years ago. Living here, I've been here since 1999. I've talked to, Bonnie actually stopped by one time and we talked and she told me what was going on, got me interested to come find out what's gonna happen in our city with that, because for me, I already pay $500 as part of both apparatuses elsewhere. If I can't even bring it home to load it, why am I loading it?
I believe you can do that.
But even if I had it here for 3 or 4 days to work on it, I guess where I'm going is, for me, when we talked and we both kind of threw out an idea, if you offered a permit, so once you develop the code, change it hopefully to not be perpendicular to the home, and you said it couldn't be in your driveway for more than 48 hours, would you ever offer a permit that says, hey, I come in, I need to work on this for, I want to put my driveway for 7 days?
I don't know the legalities of that, but yes.
I'm just offering it as an idea.
I've also owned boats and RVs and stored them in other places and brought them home to work on them. I know exactly what you're saying.
And I wouldn't park it in front of my house because I don't prolong for
Right,
extended
I
period of time.
understand. There should be, I never thought about a permit to come for work on your vehicle for 5 days or something along those lines, but I don't see why that couldn't happen.
I know when you drive around the town, you see a variety from just dilapidated boats, dilapidated RVs, to a myriad of everything else. Cargo trailers, boats, RVs, all on one person's driveway. You see a myriad of everything.
That was a very good idea, thank you. That was
That's
good.
all I think, yeah, that's good.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, if, when you guys come up to talk, if you can fill out one of those forms, the last couple of you didn't, and please give it to Mr. Basis.
We have any other comments? Okay, well then let's move on to the task number 6 summary report. Who's doing that?
That was included in your packets as just reference material, so that was the summary report that came out of this. Essentially, everything in the presentation summarized that. If you have any specific questions upon skimming that report, we can certainly answer those, but it's not something that we need to go over further.
Okay. What about the summary report, the appendix?
The appendix is a very large document that includes the raw data for all of the survey results and also some of the data for the property appraiser's office that we got regarding the decade build of homes. It's just the data that was referenced in the report. The main reason we did that is because we heard from one gentleman here, he wanted to see all the survey results, so we added that in the report in case anybody wanted to see it line by line.
So basically, you're finished.
Correct.
So I guess the next thing we need to go is to a discussion on what we've heard, where we want to go.
Or did you want to?
You have a presentation, we'll do that now?
If you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
It should take about 15 minutes because there are 2 videos I'd like to show. And it just goes a little bit further on to what Yasheen and Rodney had talked about with turf block, and that really is just one product. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you so much. So like I was saying, this is, I just want to talk a little bit more about low impact development, some of the things like they were talking about, like turf block. There's several other products out there, and I also want to show you an example of someone that has done something like this in our community. So when we're talking about low impact development, what we're talking about is really trying to get the constructed area to mimic what's out there in nature. Where in nature, what happens when it rains, water seeps down into the ground, the bacteria, the chemical action of going against the sand and all that clean the water. So a lot of the things that we're talking about will be doing that. They really focus on the processes of infiltration, again, the water seeping down into the ground, filtration, the storage, evaporation, and transpiration of that. When we're talking about these systems, we're often not talking about you put in one device and everything is just cleaned up. We talk about something called the treatment train, or in this case, we're calling the BMP, Best Management Practices Treatment Train. So again, we're putting lots of things together to improve the water quality out there. Things all come from the Clean Water Act of 1972, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, things like that. And again, we're looking at things like source controls, retention, detention, filtration, treatment and harvesting mechanisms. So, like I said, one of the biggest things that we talk about is to, keep that area kind of grassy so that water can suck down into it. So let's see, But let's see what University of Florida just talks for about 4 minutes on permeable area, and they show you some great options.
The biggest impact on stormwater runoff is impervious surfaces like this parking lot. All of the water that hits this surface during a storm event actually runs off and has to be managed downstream somewhere in a stormwater basin or some other retention area. We have alternative ways to deal with that, though, with pervious surfaces, allowing some of that water to actually infiltrate back into the ground where it was before the parking lot. So we're going to show you some of those different designs, different types of materials. So instead of impervious surfaces, now we have lots of different types of permeable materials. This is just one example. This is a paper stone that's been made out of aggregate material that's held together by resin. I'm just going to show you an example of how much water it can take and how quickly it infiltrates. This, of course, is going a lot faster than rainfall, but you can see how the water is going right through that pervious surface and comes out the bottom. That's actually one of the key aspects of the design of permeable surfaces. It's not just creating a pervious surface here, but we also have to create a reservoir underneath this surface to capture that water, at least temporarily during a storm, and then allow it to infiltrate. So one of the designs behind these pervious materials is to create a reservoir with larger aggregate material. This is 57 stone, and actually is underneath this pervious asphalt material about 6 inches deep. So when the rain comes, it infiltrates quickly through the surface, is stored temporarily in this reservoir, and then is allowed to infiltrate into the natural soils underneath that are not too compacted during this construction process. So this is pervious asphalt. It's another type of permeable material, not often used in Florida, especially in areas where there's a lot of traffic, because the heat in Florida can cause that to deform a little bit. More likely you'd use pervious concrete. This is an example of pervious concrete. In most instances, the only thing that changes with this material is they remove the sand. They remove the finer aggregate material. So you just have the larger rock material and the binder, which in this case is cement. So this is another example of a pervious material that can be used to help infiltrate some of that stormwater. Again, here's the impervious asphalt surface over here, which is very important for driving. But over here, where there's parking happening, we actually have this sort of a snowflake block where it's concrete that's impervious, about 60%. But then there's these openings, these voids that are backfilled with sand, and that's where the water can infiltrate during a storm. This snowflake box actually helps to distribute the weight of the car as well, so that the soils underneath are not getting compacted, and it maintains that infiltration capacity. Because that's still loose soil, this grass can actually come up in between and starts to create a different character than some of the other sorts of pervious materials. So this is another type of pervious material. It's actually made out of recycled tire chrome. It's bound together by a resin. But it's a little different than the previous example we had. This one really doesn't require an underlayment or any sort of reservoir underneath. And because it's bound together, it can almost be laid on like a carpet. And it doesn't require a lot of site prep. It's very flexible with regards to roots and things. And that's one of the reasons it was applied here on the University of Florida campus in one of the conservation areas, so that there wasn't a lot of site prep required. It was able to be laid down. It's very compatible with a lot of the roots, a lot of the natural area that this particular application requires. The other reason we put this pervious material in here is to minimize the erosion that was occurring. This pathway here had a lot of water and sediments that were coming down before that pavement was applied. And that water would end up in this creek with a lot of sediment and a lot of contamination. By applying the pervious material, we reduced that runoff, we minimized the amount of particulate load that was coming into the creek, and now this water flows a lot clearer with a lot less sediment. And that's the real objective behind low impact development. Trying to deal with source control, minimize the runoff, minimize the pollutants, so we protect the rivers, the lakes, and the ocean, ultimately, as well as our groundwater. If you're interested in this pervious material, contact me, Mark Clark, with the Soil and Water Science Department at the University of Florida.
So obviously, you see there's a lot of benefits there. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's going to protect, if we decide to allow vehicles to park on there, it'll protect against ruts, things like that. And of course, sand washing that sediment from your property. We won't have to watch the whole thing, but just to show you a couple more decorative options. Again, we have lots of tools in our toolbox that we can use, and I'd like to see some of these come into our code.
Hi, I'm Kenneth, and I'm Mark Clark. We're going to talk about an LID practice called pervious materials or pervious pavement. Right now, basically, we're in a residential area, so this particular pervious pavement is going to talk about the driveway landscape. Typically, if it was impervious, basically when rain would hit it, some might enter into the landscape and the lawn, but a lot of it would run right out the driveway into the street and get incorporated into the stormwater management infrastructure. So if we can create a pervious system, we can remove that water from the stormwater and essentially make it go somewhere else.
That's right. So permeable pavements, as they're commonly known, allow for water that hits it or lands on it or runs onto it to infiltrate through the subsurface and typically infiltrate into the ground below it. The profile here is typically you've got a paver. In this case, we have what are called interlocking concrete pavers. And then below that, you've got maybe 8, 12, 15 inches of stone that allows for water to quickly infiltrate through the pavers into that stone and be stored and slowly soak into the subsurface.
So again, just wanted to show that we do have lots of different tools in our toolkit that we could be working with. These things are environmentally friendly, they're aesthetically pleasing, and the price seems to be coming down quite drastically as they're becoming used more and more. So just giving an example of another product that was used here locally is this paver grid. Again, it's an example of low impact development. You can see you have basically a grid there that you go back and you fill over with dirt. In this particular case, you're looking at a driveway that was asphalt. The asphalt was removed. A low profile version of this, about an inch, came through. They backfilled over it with dirt, and then you see the final product. And again, it's going to keep ruts away. It's going to look good, and it's got quite a few benefits I'll talk about in just a second. I'm just showing you. We saw a couple in the video, but just showing you a couple other types of pervious pavement that could be used. Pervious concrete, turf block, flexi-pave, the thing you just saw. So what happens? The impact to the environment here, you're going to reduce your stormwater runoff volume that needs to be treated. Now, remember, this city does not have a stormwater utility fee. However, most local governments in the state of Florida do, and they look at how much pervious area you have on your property to determine what your monthly charge is. So again, this is a good thing if that's an impact to you. It's going to reduce the pollutants. Again, it's going to trap into that grass or whatever is there, go into the ground and be treated. That's going to have benefits for red tide, algal blooms, things like that. Reduces ambient temperatures. When you put, just concrete and asphalt there, that's like a radiator. It just gets hotter and hotter, and it actually creates a dome basically over your city, or this is probably the whole county here, that keeps things hot, reduces rainfall events, things like that. It provides habitat for wildlife, improves air quality, and again, I think it's a very attractive element. Thanks for your attention. So we got kicked out of here. But some of the good things about this is that you don't need to, at least at the moment, you don't need to get this permitted if it's considered landscaping. It's, again, the prices are going down. It's easy to install. You know, again, just a resident did it on their own here. So again, thank you for your attention, and I just wanted to let you know that there's, if you want to talk more, there's so many different resources that we can use, like the Florida Stormwater Association, Florida Water and Pollution Control Operators Association, the Stormwater Erosion Sedimentation Control Inspector Program at the Department of Environmental Protection. Pinellas County has its own stormwater manual. Florida has its own erosion control manual. Again, there's so many things, and I'll be more than happy to share it with residents and obviously the council if we choose to incorporate that into our codes. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for everything that they've been doing tonight. A lot of it seems to be answering questions on how to take care of things. My question is, you'll think I'm nuts when I ask this, but why are we here? We've already gone through with all the different laws. Council just came up with the different codes that they want this to be. Are we here this evening to change the pre-existing codes? Are we here to add more codes? Exactly why are we here this evening discussing Chapter 54? Where are we going from this point?
I believe we were here because at one of the other meetings, 3 council members signed documents last year and didn't really know what the documents were that they changed. There were a lot of the codes that were changed, and when asked, no one knew what was changed or why it was changed, but yet your signatures were on the documents. That's my understanding of why we're here again.
What was changed?
I don't know, I wasn't on council then.
Well,
But there were a lot of things. We worked 2 years with Randy on the meetings before the new council came on last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent a lot of time going over and over. This meeting seems to me like it's just about recreational vehicles parking. I thought it was about cars parking on the yard, other things, parking in the street. I didn't realize it was just on recreational vehicles, boats, and motorhomes. I thought it was about other things that were in Chapter 54.
I've heard tidbits of things going through.
Right, so I didn't realize it was just for this particular thing. But the codes need to be talked about and enforced, because I don't believe the police department and that, well, now they're not doing the codes, but Dave that is doing them needs to have an understanding of what the codes are and what he has to talk to the people about to clean up. And right now, I don't think we know that, so how can we expect the code enforcement to know that? That's just my opinion.
Okay. Are you here tonight to change the codes?
I'm here to talk about what the codes are and maybe what we need to change moving forward. What's enforceable, as they call it, what's enforceable. But I didn't know it was just about recreational vehicles.
I don't think it's just about recreational vehicles.
Because in the codes before, it listed how many you could have, where they had to be parked, no parking on the grass for cars, and.
Are we here to change that?
There's a lot of sections in 54.
I think I can.
So we can address those other sections in 54 too.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Are we just here for one section?
Randy, go ahead, please.
Thank you, and I apologize for interrupting your discourse. As I've said a few times in the past, 2 things can be true. Forward Pinellas' engagement is for the purpose of evaluating recreational vehicles and how they're parked and normalized standards on regulating recreational vehicles. That was the scope of their engagement, and that was in response to one of the core concerns raised was the lack of understanding on what the standards in the community were as to recreational vehicles and whether we still wish to stand by those standards. So in as much as Forward Pinellas has given you a report that focuses on that, that's because they fulfilled the duty that they were given. As I advised you folks on the beginning of this, you are the legislators in this community. It is your decision what happens in any section of your code. When you're under the hood, you look at everything. So if you wish to discuss substantively other elements of Chapter 54, that is entirely within your purview. Nobody from staff, legal, or otherwise has told you can only look at this issue. This is the only place you folks get to do business as a body. So if you have business you wish to do, now's the time. Historically, when Councilmember Roberts was in her previous term, this council adopted regulations to Chapter 54. After its adoption, and at the rollout, the beginnings of its enforcement, there was substantial community feedback and, candidly, displeasure with what was adopted. This council, under the new term, heard some of that that started in 2019. And between 2019 and into 2020, before 2020, there were a series of workshops just like this, no fewer than, I think, at least 4, where we discussed, or hearings that could have been workshops, where we discussed exactly what was going to be changed from what was previously adopted and being implemented. In what I would call the first round of amendment, when you were previously on council, there were regulations about size, number, etc. Those were some of the feedback that the community came back and said, we're not as interested in all of those things. Some of it also came down to enforceability. If we say it can't be over X amount of thousands of pounds, and this, who's measuring that? Who's objectively determining that? There were limits, proposed limitations on how close a vehicle in the driveway could be to the roadway. Were we going to get out rulers and measure at the end of everybody's driveway, and what were we really going to allocate resources to? My consistent advice to any legislative body I serve is don't pass any measure you don't want to have to enforce, or to explain why your folks are enforcing it. And so some amendments were made. And that's the legislative process. My law firm prevailed on a series of cases down in Holmes Beach, and some of the language that came out of those judicial orders was municipal governments frequently add to and subtract from their legislative enactments and have the power to do so. So if you wish to add to or subtract from, here's where we start having that discussion. If you wish for an education and a tutorial, we can do that another time, and we can have a session where staff gets together and we can do a comprehensive, here's what it says, and what can and will be enforced. To the extent that there's a discussion about enforcement, management has already changed how it's handling that from previous administrations. And I would add to that all things in context, we need to remember that in the last roughly year and a half, you had, during most of 2020, or rather at the end of 2019, your chief of police resigned at the time, or retired. Then going into that, you have the pandemic. At one point, some members of this body were even discussing putting a halt on any kind of code enforcement as a recognition of the pressure that the pandemic was putting on people in 2020. And so there was a number of reasons why enforcement, adding to that the loss of the clerk, the manager, and staff during much of the last year in 2021. And so there's been reasons why things haven't happened. It hasn't been pure inaction. And there's also an effort to educate the public and get the public's feedback, which is why we're here. I know it's a very long-winded explanation to your question, but I think the context is important, and sometimes that can get lost in the discourse as we talk past each other. So at this point tonight, you can decide whether you wish to change anything, what that looks like. You don't have to decide tonight, oh, this says 30 feet and I want it to be 31. If your consensus direction is staff, we'd like you to look at changing generally the size requirements to increase it and what would be appropriate based on, then that's ample direction enough. If your direction is we really want to see a reevaluation of parking on whether it's what driveways are composed of or whether we're going to revisit the discussion on grass and streets, again, all of that comes from you. You give us the direction, we'll bring you something to look at. But you don't need to get tonight to and this is the precise number, and this is the precise way, and these are the 5 composite materials that we saw in the video that we want to use. If your direction is please look at driveway materials or please look at enforcement, then that's fine. We just need consensus direction if staff is going to do anything based on your feedback.
So does anybody up here have anything that they are just quite adamant about that they want changed on chapter 54?
Well, I don't know what all it says, because I wasn't at the meetings then because of COVID, but I read some of it, and a lot of it is not understanding, and I'm up here on the council and I don't understand it, so I'm sure the public doesn't understand it if they had a chance to read what was in that chapter. Do we need to go over all of it? Probably not, but I didn't realize that we were just here for one thing tonight, because, I mean, if you drive through my neighborhood at night, you'll see 8 cars parked across the yard. No, I don't want 8 cars parked across the yard where I live.
I don't blame you.
So is that included in this, or is that included in another discussion?
I don't think this is included in this, but I think with some of the ideas that they have with increasing the size of the driveways will also help that. Maybe not in a whole, but it may help address some of that, which is something we can also still look into as far as the car park stuff at a later date.
Okay, let me ask the public a bit, you know, why are you here? I mean, are we protesting? Are we asking questions? Are there things that you want to change? Okay, I'll get back to you.
So for me, it would be, I was under the impression, I've been here since '99, I have never had any issue with an RV or a boat in my parking lot, and then roughly a year and a half ago, I get a flyer, which was a congressional amendment to read and understand, and I feel like I'm a pretty intelligent individual, so to your point, I had to read it like 3 times to realize, and then even coming to a commission meeting recently, I can't even be perpendicular, I have to be perpendicular to my home. So for me, it is to go back and relook at what was done in the previous administration and make it more reasonable for the residents in town.
More reasonable to understand?
Well, I guess I can keep reading it, and at some point I'll understand it. But my, I guess, request to you, the council and the mayor, would be go back and take a look at it. I think some things that are in there are unfair.
Size, length, width?
Well, I probably don't meet any of the above, so, but again, I park mine off-site. If I have the ability to bring it home and I'm not gonna get a ticket, then I'm probably fine. But
I
when
think that
do
you're
put it
probably
in
going to be just fine, sir.
when I put it in my driveway, it's at an angle, and it's there for 2 days or 3 days.
It's not an issue. It can't.
Well, but your code says it is. It has to be perpendicular.
Let me speak on that, because I also have a recreational vehicle, or boat, by the way, and I park it perpendicular, but I have a circular driveway as well. If I angled it, it would actually be easier for me to angle it than it would be to park it perpendicular.
So if it's in your driveway at an angle.
It's not currently, because I can still get it.
But you have to be lucky enough to have a driveway that it fits in, I don't. So
Right.
Yeah, so-
But I'm agreeing with you as
Yeah.
far as the perpendicular, because I think it would be easier for me to also park it that way. And it's not sideways, it's just at an angle, like you're talking about.
So then I guess it would be, if you say, you guys come back and say, no, it has to be perpendicular, and it says it's over 30 feet, if I put in a circular driveway.
I think that if we went with your first suggestion of having a permit to come after to work on I think that that would be a point that we need to look at, to change, to give people the ability to have an RV who is stored off someplace else to come home, to load it up, to go on their trip, to work on their vehicle, whatever it takes, you know, and if it's a 5-day permit with an option of another 5 days if you're not done or something, as long as it's not a permanent. It is a working scenario. It's no different than a contractor pulling a permit and being able to put a dumpster out in front of a house while the house is under construction.
Absolutely.
Okay? That's something that needs to be changed in our laws. So we need to, that would be something that we could bring forth.
I agree.
So yeah, to answer your question, yes, some things need to be changed in this.
Okay,
You know,
so that's something that needs to be changed.
Right,
And now we're making progress.
Right, so things, you know, I've always had a problem, even when we sat up here and passed it with the size, you know, because one size I wanna say thank you for all of your, you know, your great work. There's a lot that went into this, and I think it's very informative, so thank you very much.
Okay.
But so one size does not fit all, so right now it's 30 feet, you know, and it has to be perpendicular. And so what if somebody has a larger driveway, as was, you know, we've just seen, we have larger driveways, smaller driveways and things like that. So, you know, is it beneficial? We have houses that were built in the 70s that have large driveways, large houses. We have houses that were built in the 50s that may have larger driveways. You know, so is it advantageous to everybody to have a specific hard-clad, you know, feet? I would say no. You know, I think we need to look at what the sizes are and make some rules, safety rules around that.
That's nothing we're gonna change this evening.
Well, no,
That's
I'm just
something we
saying-
can put on the agenda for a discussion of the size.
And how do you make a size rule for everyone that has a driveway? How do you make a rule, 10 different lengths or widths for someone to go out and have to watch over this and go, okay, well, his house was built here, so he can have this and he can, it needs to be one size.
Well, I can give you an example though, like for my driveway, I can't put anything more than 30 foot. So I wouldn't attempt to put a 40 footer there because it's not gonna fit. But if you accept a 40 footer on somebody that has a driveway, like you were saying, why not let them put it there?
Because a lot of times 40 foot comes
I
out
was
further.
just, I think 40 foot's a little extensive.
But say 40 foot,
You know.
and when you're backing out of your driveway, you can't see around 40 feet. I have that problem with the cars that park all the way to the end, and they're big trucks and that. I have to get halfway out in the street to see what's coming either way, because they're too long for the driveways. So how do you make a code?
I think that you.
That's the purpose of the setback. That's
That-
exactly.
that's-
Excuse me.
We have to have one person talking at a time.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Sorry.
Quit talking.
So how do you make a rule that's
Well,
good for
maybe
you,
not so
you,
much-
you, and everybody has a different rule to
Barbara,
follow?
what about so much size, but you have a sidewalk? Okay, some people have a short distance between their house and that sidewalk. Whatever vehicle that they have cannot cross that sidewalk.
Right.
Okay, it doesn't matter if it's 20 foot, 30 foot, or whatever, it cannot block the sidewalk. Or it cannot be past the curb by so many feet, you know, maybe 2 feet, 3 feet from the curb. It has nothing to do with the size of the motorhome, okay? And also, I mean, you can make all those rules and everything, but what about the next door neighbor also, who doesn't have an RV, who opens up their curtain and they're looking at this mammoth thing in their front yard? Is that fair to them? You know, it's just.
Well, that's what I'm saying. How do you make a rule that fits each person's driveway?
You're not gonna make everybody happy.
Okay, well,
You're not
Bonnie
gonna
just
make everybody
said
happy.
we should have different rules for different driveways, is what I understood.
If I may, just before you started this colloquy, you did make an open appeal to public comment, and in order to preserve order and flow of the meeting, my advice is if you're going to open it to the public,
let them go.
allow them to talk, close public comment, and then continue your discourse.
Okay, gotcha.
But that's at your discretion.
That's it.
Thank you. Stephen Wonderly, 4883 Lake Charles Drive. You asked why we're here. We're not here to revolt, I don't think. I believe this gentleman behind me and this lady here were here a year and a half ago, and we said, look, we stayed or moved here or did what we did because of the way the rules were. You altered the rules to make us violators of the law. She moved her trailer out.
Well put.
Yeah. But within code.
Within code,
Just let the individual who's.
until the rule change. I know it's hard to make it work for everybody. But we're gonna say if my RV is so far out that when I back out of the driveway, you can't see, well, I can't pull out of the Dunkin' Donuts and make a right on 66th Street because Kmart's got trees on the sidewalk. Do we enforce that setback? No. So let's be realistic. We're gonna enforce something on a residential property, let's enforce it everywhere, right? And let's be realistic, people stayed or made purchases based on what the rules were 2 years ago, right? Just trying to be sure, that's all.
Okay, thank you.
Can you fill us that?
Oh, I did.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger, man, 55474. As a year ago, I came up, I purposely bought in Kenneth City because I like the city. I purposely bought the house that I have because it has a 50-foot driveway, double 50-foot driveway, and I can put my boat. The length is 31 feet. That extra foot is that 4x4 square piece of metal that's holding the hitch on. It's not the boat, it's the end of the trailer by 1 foot. So my solution would be drop $700 and put a hinge on it, and the boat's still not going anywhere. It's staying in my driveway, because then it's 30 feet. So I think if your driveway can accommodate the boat and you comply with the setback that eliminates the safety concerns about pulling out of the driveway, blocking a sidewalk, things like that, then the size of the vehicle wouldn't matter that much. If you comply with the safety concerns.
If you have a big enough driveway.
If you have a big enough driveway and the vehicle's on concrete and not on grass, and it's in not disrepair. I think, unsightly, I think was the word that was used a year ago, unsightly, and a lot of people took offense to that. But it's not hard, it's very simple. I didn't buy an HOA because you can't have the boat at your home only on the weekends. If you leave it a day, they take a picture, they send you a letter, they send you a fine. Like working on your boat over the weekend or whatnot, you won't use 1 extra day. And I didn't buy in Lealman because they don't have the codes, regulations that you had when I bought my house here. It had the setback, it had the particular materials that you had to park your boat on. And when I drove around, I didn't see anything that was unsightly in Kenneth City. I drove all around the neighborhood. There are cars in the street, it's annoying. There are cars at night parked on the grass. That, in my opinion, should be enforced.
Thank you.
And from the original meeting, I thought that the consultation that they did was gonna be biased. I thought there was an agenda by someone on council to get rid of all the boats and RVs last year. I don't think they're here anymore, but I thought there was an agenda to do that within Kenneth City. And I did come in here today with a biased opinion that what they were doing was part of that agenda. And they put together a very good presentation. It was fair.
Thank you, sir.
Robert Harrison, 6048 45th Avenue North. The reason I came here tonight is because I've read that ordinance 54, and I don't think it's that hard to understand. I've read it 2 or 3 times. I've been involved in this, come to this meeting for the last 2 years when we discussed this. And why did we start this 2 years ago? Was because we wanted to improve the image of Kenneth City. Improve the image of what it looked like. I guarantee you that I can drive around, and one of the gentlemen who has the large RV and boat, that talked about, I guarantee I've never seen that thing parked for more than 3 days on his property. And he used to live across the street from me on 45th Avenue, if you remember that. But I've never seen him, he's always been responsible with his RV. I guarantee if we drove around tonight, we would probably see maybe 10 or 12 boats or RVs parked on their driveways, in Kenneth City. And I also guarantee you we're gonna see 60 cars parked on grass. And some of them, 4 and 5 of them, where the dirt is eroded, the grass is eroded. We can't even keep the fire department from parking on the grass, and there's 70 spots out here. That's what I thought we were gonna do, was improve the image of Kenneth City. We could debate this RV issue for another 20 years, we're never gonna solve it, but we sure can resolve this parking on grass. Because I think the boat owners are responsible enough, they got a lot of investment in it, and they're gonna park their vehicles. I used to have an RV and I couldn't park it on the grass because it erodes the tires. So, you gotta park it in a responsible way, but we sure could do something about these cars parked all over everywhere. Because I guarantee you there's probably 60 of them right now parked all over Kenneth City. That's what I thought 50 foot wasn't what we were gonna talk about. So it's cleaning that image up. Thank you.
Yes, it is on there. And that's what I wanted to address, just to hang on to Barbara earlier, I just wanted to.
Let me ask if there's any more.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Is there any more public comments? Okay, at this time, I'd like to close public comment, and, give you the floor for a second.
No, again, this is from your previous statement, that you know that, you're right. chapter 54 includes lots of things, and it does seem like tonight we are just addressing the RV issue and the boat issues, but I agree the primary concern is if we're gonna clean up this town, the parking on the grass and the parking on the roads and blocking our streets
I believe
is our primary, and it is.
It's
I mean,
already on.
right now, right, it says option 1, continue to prohibit the grass parking of recreational vehicles in residential areas. I remember there was confusion about how to enforce chapter 54, and I believe that was part of the conversation as to why we had this workshop as well. Yes, there might be some changes that we want to make in chapter 54, but ultimately we need to make sure that it is enforceable, so that way the people who have complied with these changes this whole time don't feel like they did all this or wasted all their money for nothing when other residents have just been not complying. And again, we do have someone now who is a non-police officer, code enforcement, and this is the time. If we agree, chapter 54 is ready to go. We can say right now, we want you to enforce it, go do it, and then guess what, no parking on grass immediately, because it's already a thing. So we need to just make sure it's being enforced. And if there's certain things in chapter 54 that we want to address, the boat size, or coming, the setbacks and not blocking the roadways or the sidewalks, I'm totally open for that, but I know that there are some things in chapter 54, like the parking on the grass, that I'm 100% okay with, and I just would like to see it be enforced.
And for the sake of clarity in the discussion, the way chapter 54 is organized, there's a general provision on vehicles and a whole other section on recreational vehicles. In the vehicles section, one of the first sections after the definitions is section 54-111. In sub 1 of that section, it says, within the incorporated limits of the town, except when necessary to avoid conflict with other traffic or in compliance with law or the directions of law enforcement, I'm paraphrasing, no person shall stop, stand, or park a vehicle, and then sub J is on the grass or soil in the front or side yard of a residential property. It's explicitly stated, present, that a vehicle, not just a recreational vehicle, a vehicle with its ordinary definition, cannot be parked in the grass. I will tell you, to the extent that there was a delay, if you will, in the enforcement of chapter 54 as it relates to parking on the grass, it was to modify your land development code, chapter 66, to accommodate, if not precisely the solutions offered tonight, whether through Ford, Pinellas, or the manager, but to say, okay, you can't park on the grass, but here's what you can do to change your property to accommodate the fact that you have 3 teenagers in your home who each own their own car because they have jobs or whatever in different parts of the county, or whatever it may be in your own household situation. So if you're going to if your direction is to enforcement, I just want to make sure you have the context that previous enforcement measures were delayed by efforts to modify your driveway substrate options and provide people affordable options, which was a concern and feedback for those of you who were not on council on the time heard, where previous administration was saying, well, if you get this brick layer and you get this, people saying, I'm on a fixed income, I can't afford that very, very nice looking thing you might see in the Outer Banks or whatever. And so something to consider as context for those of you who may not have been as involved in the discourse at that time, that if you're pairing enforcement, one of the advisories was that you pair it with changing your code to provide more options for driveway substrates. The other part of that being, because it's in your land development code, likely would have to go through one of the subordinate boards and then this body. That is to say, it wouldn't be enacted overnight.
Sure, okay. And obviously there was no progress made on that, so, I mean, obviously I recommend then that we have a workshop to discuss the land development code.
I think what we need to walk away here from tonight is the fact that no parking on the grass. Everybody seems to agree, no parking on the grass. We've already got that as a law. All we've got to do is enforce that law, okay? And by enforcement is by education, not by going out and finding a bunch of people, but if you enforce it and they keep doing it, if it's the law, then we have the resources to be able to say, stop it now, okay? That's all I'm saying, all right?
Some of these driveway solutions will, not only for recreational vehicles, but we should include that in parking with regular vehicles as well, and I think that would also help address some of that.
We're not going to change anything tonight as far as RV length and all that kind of stuff. We're not gonna do that. It's gonna be more of a discussion, I think, going on further. But the biggest thing that we need to come away from here is the fact that we're going to have the residents be able to put these different types of driveways in so they can get the vehicle over and park with no permits and do all that kind of stuff. And make it more easily for the residents to have parking spaces in front of their home. You know, and each home has to be dealt with on a different basis. We can't just say, you know, this is the way it's going to be, you know, because there's different scenarios for different neighborhoods. It's like my driveway. I have a nice long driveway. I put a 29-foot fifth wheel in my driveway with no issues. I have a very wide driveway because my yard is very wide, and I was able to stay away from the next door neighbor's yard. I have the proper setbacks on my driveway, and I have a very wide driveway, but it's within all the limits that were set forth. You go to the other side of my house, and my neighbor's driveway is actually 6 inches on my property, you know? And when this was all coming down, I came to the city, and I was not on the council, I was not anything, and I said, I have a driveway next door to me on my yard, 6 inches. And I said, what can I do about it? And they said, the city can't do anything about it, that's a civil suit, you know? And so, I mean, I wasn't really pressing it, you know, I just wanted to know the information of what the ability that I had to take care of my own personal property. My fence in the back of my house is 2 feet on one end of my house over my property line, my neighbor's property. Did I do anything about it? No. I mean, what difference does 2 feet going to make? You know, it's not. I'm just trying to get along with everybody. And that's what I'm saying here tonight is, let's just establish the fact that the public, the council, the city manager, everybody has one thing that they've agreed to tonight, and that should be no parking on the grass. To get rid of 6 and 8 cars in people's front yard. That's terrible looking. That's absolutely terrible looking. Let's take his idea of being able to give somebody a permit to be able to bring their RV home or their boat home and work on it in their own yard. I think that's a wonderful idea. I never even thought about a permit to do so. I always thought it was okay to do so, but when Randy says it's the law, it's the law. Okay, how do we get around that law? Let's do a permit for being able to bring home a vehicle. And we don't have to be so stringent that say, well, 5 days you're out of here. You know, you might be, of course, in this day of time, you're ordering parts and stuff for a vehicle or whatever. And guess what? Everything is delayed.
Well, regulates.
You know, and yeah, like I say, it regulates it. As far as the other things go, as far as the size of RVs, the back set, everything is already in place. Do we need to change something? But do we have to have all these big, huge meetings and discussions on trying to make it better? I don't think so. I think we just need to do it. So, does anyone have any? Am I wrong?
No, do I get a chance now?
No. Go ahead.
So I would like to see the driveways, looked at if it's an actual driveway, you know, as was suggested. We have 20 feet to 24 feet, that would help.
Mm-hmm.
If there's duplexes, I would like to see the code change so it would adopt what the suggestion was. What actually defines a driveway? If you're using permeable items that was displayed, so if you're using something and we need to come up with a solution for these people, they clearly don't have the space to park their cars. What's the solution? What actually defines a driveway? We defined it as asphalt, some gravel or something, you know, some concrete or pavers, I think. I think we need to put, you know, adopt again the suggestion to include the interlocking concrete or use the plastic where if you have, stones in there, it's ADA compliant, and, you know, it's gonna look nice. You know, so we need to include those things and allow our residents, but then if so, for instance, if you have a, just use the interlocking concrete driveway, okay? If it's, since it's permeable, and I absolutely don't know the answer to this, so pay attention, Randy.
Always.
So if you have the, you know, if you have it 3 feet from the neighbor, I mean, can it extend further, like say, so like if you just have like a square front yard, if it's permeable, can it extend to 3 feet over from the other neighbor yard?
So one of the suggestions that had been made was extending, or rather shortening the setback on the side for driveways, and perhaps maybe not the driveway, but the driveway apron, which was another discussion. I want to be clear that the code presently does, chapter 54 presently does define a driveway, and this is the broader definition that would be put into your land development code so they were in harmony, and perhaps this can be expanded as well. But a driveway is defined in chapter 54, and it says a driveway means a pathway on residential or commercial property which is designed and intended to be used to park motor vehicles or other vehicles generally used to travel on public roads or streets. For purposes of this section, meaning chapter 54, a driveway shall be constructed of concrete, asphalt, rock pavers, or materials such as stone, rock, shale, gravel, shell, or similar material which permeates water into the underlying natural surface and which is properly contained to prevent the composition materials from being washed away. Which answers the question you were asking on when you do have these loose systems, like whether it's mulch was not one of them, but gravel, shale, shell, coquina. If you have something like that, and it's in a pile here, why is that not a driveway? Well, it's not put in a situation where a vehicle can park on it, and it's not bounded to avoid washout. Once it's bounded to avoid washout, and in a place where a vehicle can park on it, that makes it a driveway under the code, subject to permits and other things. And so that is the current definition in your code of a driveway. When I talk about chapter 66, I believe it was to harmonize it with this newer definition that was developed during the course of the previous discussions. And my advice to you at this point, again, it's totally your meeting, your process, but it seems that we keep finding and saying we need to look at X, Y, or Z and finding that a version of that is already in the code. And maybe we need to have I hate volunteering myself to do things. Whether it be a presentation, a white paper, or something that says, here's the plan, here are the 10 issues Randy or Pete or Anna, whomever we want to know about and know what the code presently says in plain speak, so we know what to do, then that might be something worthwhile. But it seems there's a lot of assumption baked into this dialogue, not necessarily grounded in the text of it.
So my question then, so if you're using a paver grid, so that contains the stones, okay? So if I used, so say I use some kind of decorative stone or something and I use paver grid, is there a restriction on what a driveway looks like or the size of it outside the setbacks? So if I had 8 cars and I used a paver grid, and the stones, they don't wash away or anything like that, they're there, it's ADA compliant, you know, it's just like a driveway, but it just washes down into the ground. Go ahead.
I'm not a permitting official. I can tell you this code underscores the point that you cannot build a driveway without getting appropriate permits, if applicable. So if a permit is required, and that is what our building department and town administration are for, say this is what I'm looking to do I need some kind of permit or some kind of compliance measure that I've not contemplated? That's how that process is designed to work. And that's because under the law, the answer to every question starts with, it depends. So your proposal for what pavers like this look like might be slightly different from Kyle's, and that has to be independently and individually ascertained.
Well, I know the law, you don't have to have a permit to do this. I've already talked to the building department.
Understood.
But what I'm asking is there a definition outside of the setbacks of what, if you put down like say I wanted, my front yard is a stone front yard now, and I used a paver grid. Is that defined as a front yard, or can I park my cars on there because there will be no ruts, the stones are contained? So I'm asking, is that?
There are impervious surface limitations.
It's a pervious surface.
So your question is, if I make my entire front yard a pervious surface, can my entire front yard be a parking lot?
Pretty much.
That's what I'm.
Well, like I say, what is the definition of a driveway? Because everybody thinks, there's my garage, my driveway goes up to that. That's it, that's a driveway. Is there another definition? How can we solve some of the problems where somebody has an 8-foot driveway and maybe a 20-foot long driveway? They have 3 children, they have a mom and dad, the kids are going to college, they all live in the house. What do we do? So if you take a page of it, is that something that we can look at, is what I'm asking? Because you asked for direction, and I'm asking these questions.
No, I understand. So in chapter 66, section 1, subsection 113, it has measurement of driveway width or spacing shall not include any necessary corner radii, flares for turning movements. It has standards for alignment and minimum distance to property lines. Outside of the setback, I'm not seeing, as I sit here now, the precise limitation, setback being the primary one.
Sure.
In terms of, let me slow down. I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of your code. I analyze each issue as it's presented to me. If presented that hypothetical, rather than give you an answer here that is unresearched and ill-timed and therefore incomplete, I would rather say, if this proposal, then what result, and give you that analysis, whether that be in a memorandum or whether that be, now, when we've looked at this, we've considered this eventuality, and here's how we're regulating it. Normally what you have is something, if it's not already regulated in chapter 66, which is where the design standards for a driveway presently exist, and what I'm advising we revisit, because that has not been revisited with the same circumspect review that chapter 54 has, that would be as simple as, and shall not exceed a maximum surface area ratio of X. And that sentence solves that entire issue. And we would have to establish a number. And I want to remind you, as legislators, you're never going to find a number that makes everybody happy. Whenever you draw a line, and I don't mean this in a judgmental way, whenever you draw a line in the sand, somebody's on the winning side, somebody's on the losing side. If you're asking staff to find you the solution that will make every resident come in here and say, you guys did a great job, I can resign today because I can't do that. But I will tell you that, to answer your question more narrowly, Councilmember Noble, the kind of work and analysis you're talking about would be done in chapter 66, or presently found in chapter 66. Because that was, up until tonight, not the primary focus, I don't have that answer for you off the top of my head.
And that's fine, I'm just saying that, I think it's our responsibility to look for some solutions. You just can't say, well, I don't like people parking on the grass, and I don't like this or that, so we're not gonna do it.
May I make a quick suggestion on this?
No, we want a solution.
Okay, I have a solution. The driveway is so wide. To the one side of the driveway is the front of the house, to the other side of the driveway is your border, okay? Let's say on this side of the driveway, towards the front of your house, if you wanted to put what you're talking about, you would limit it to 2 feet or 3 feet this way. And to this way, you would have to limit it to the setback rule of so far back from the line, the property line. Because even if you make it all the way to the property line, that means that you're able to park a vehicle right on the property line, which is going to be right in your next door neighbor's living room.
Well, no, I said about the setbacks, I understand the setbacks.
Well, and presently there's a provision that on a single family development, most of which we're talking about, the maximum width for a driveway is 20 feet. So that would answer, if I have a 90 wide foot yard and I made it all a driveway, is it a driveway? No. And you have a maximum number of 2 driveways on a lot of X size, 1 driveway on a lot of another size. So there are already design standards beyond the setback that bound the maximum size of a driveway. And we would have to evaluate whether those are still consistent based on everything else this body is attempting to accomplish.
I mean, because I think we got here, and why we're here is because we implemented something, and we really didn't, have a lot of discussion, and we didn't take into consideration, you know, alternatives. People have like, a perception, we'll use that word, and their perception is reality. And so if you have a perception about what a driveway looks like, you know, you're not gonna change that. But there are other ways to maintain our properties that isn't, you know, the standard, something that somebody has perceived for 500 years. You know, like so there's other ways to do things, is all I'm saying, but I would like to look at that. I would like to look at the size. I would like to look at the driveway, the size of the vehicles. I would like to look at the setbacks and the driveway size. I would like to look at, incorporating, having the magistrate, and so we can educate people and not just give them, you know, so we can go out and be a community-oriented town.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to incorporate something like that in our code.
Can I use free management to come up with this stuff that we're talking about tonight?
Absolutely, and when we talk about the special magistrate, I've already started talking to Randy about that, so that's the next thing that we're doing in the code enforcement world. Another thing that I just want to point out is, you all told me no parking on grass, so there might be some redefinition as you're talking about, because as we're talking about with these paper grids, is that parking on grass or not? So there is some redefinition I think that we need to have here. So yes, I'd be more than happy to work on this, and not only work on it, but create some educational materials that I can hand out as well.
And remove the perpendicular too. I mean, especially people who have circular driveways, maybe they park their boat or whatever, you know, up in the, you know,
and we can definitely
parallel, yeah.
And the context for that was at the time of regulation and passed, there was a property owner who owned a recreational vehicle that was roughly the size of the home itself and parked it parallel to the home on the property. So passersby saw a recreational vehicle and little else, and there was a concern by previous council that that could proliferate if somebody got a driveway wide enough and a house small enough, that it would just look like a recreational vehicle parking lot, for one. And so that was the genesis of the directional orientation of a vehicle in the driveway. I'm not saying that you have to do that. Again, I'm just trying to make sure, because this is, there was a lot of discussion about it and a lot of evolution in what ultimately was regulated. I want to make sure you as the legislators have that information.
Yeah. Pete, when you look at a driveway, you know, and you're talking about increasing the size, on the front of the house size, it should be not allowed to go any further than 3 foot sidewalk length, okay? And that would take care of what she's saying about someone making their whole front yard a parking lot, you know, because that ain't gonna happen. So if you was only to allow a 3 foot section added to the driveway on this side, and maybe 6 foot on this side, you will have a widened driveway where you can have 2 vehicles in it.
But at current, we're talking 20 foot maximum, so that would have to be a change of course.
But that was some of the good options.
Making it 24 feet.
Correct.
Yeah.
Were great options.
But see, on the side that I'm talking about, on the house side, the measurement for the width of the driveway would not start on this side of the driveway, or on that side of the sidewalk. It would start on this side of the sidewalk, because that's a sidewalk, not a driveway. It's just making a little more room is what it's doing. So from this point, that way could be the 24 feet or whatever. That's just an idea.
What sidewalk are you talking about?
The sidewalk that goes straight up to the front of the house. Okay, not in the center of the yard, but on the side of the driveway. All houses' garages are on either one side or the other of the house, okay? So towards the front of the house, we're looking at the driveway, going up side of the driveway, there could be a 3 foot area there that is considered a sidewalk. And from Where the sidewalk meets the driveway is where the 24 feet, 22 feet, whatever you come up with, would be to allow the driveway to be that wide. That measurement would start from this side of the sidewalk, not this side of the sidewalk.
Even if there wasn't a sidewalk, as
Even
an example.
Yes, even if there's no, you're putting in a sidewalk.
Does that address circular driveways and things?
Well, circle driveway wouldn't count on anything like that. It wouldn't be the same scenario. That'd be a whole different scenario. The only thing you could do on a circular driveway is add on the garage side to whatever figure that we come up with, that they could make the driveway, correct?
Well, and that's part of the ideas to why it's so that we set that.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, I think we need to address what the driveway is, the size of the driveways, what we can use for a driveway, what we can, what you can actually park on. I mean, obviously, if you're gonna put down a paver grid and you're gonna leave a boat parked there and you never use your boat, then, I mean, you don't want your paver grid to be grass, because your grass is gonna die, it's a living thing. So you would probably want stones in there, but there's still just a tremendous amount of options, and I think it's worthwhile looking at.
I think that what we should do is have the town manager give us all the different options and discuss it. I don't think that we need to have big meetings and all this stuff to come up with it until we come up with a presentation. This is what we want to change on chapter 54.
Well, yeah, that's what Randy asked us to do, that's why I went through the list.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
What Bonnie was saying earlier about putting stones in your whole driveway and allowing 8 cars to park there. If they put grid, stones, dirt, call it whatever you want, in there to park on, what difference does it make if you park that on that or grass? What difference does it make? You're just not on grass, you still have 8 cars parking all the way across the yards, and the whole yard's covered with cars.
You'll get ruts.
You can only put this stuff that we're talking about, like I was saying, to this side of the driveway, towards the front of your house, sidewalk width.
But my point is, do you want 8 cars parked across your front yard in everybody's yard? What if everybody had 8 cars parked across the front of their house? We would look like we could go sell them and make money.
I was giving an over exaggeration, I'm trying to come up with, because what is you have 3 kids, you've got 2 adults, so maybe you have 5 cars.
They're better than in the street.
So I'm just using and trying to come up with some.
I just wanted to add to what both of you guys said. I think they're great ideas that we should look into a little bit further, but I also think we should look into the size. And we should also look into the gentleman who brought up the permit, because I think that's a great idea as well. But I also look into is as far as the educational side or the enforcement side of somebody that thinks they can put a 40-foot boat or 35-foot boat, and then they go and tear somebody else's yard. I think there needs to be something in there as notating that you have to be responsible, and you can't drive through other people's property as far as,
I want to make one suggestion, and then after that, I think that I'm pretty well done. I mean, we see people leaving, it's time to call this a meeting. But last week, we had some people complaining about vehicles being parked behind Kmart, not Kmart, because there's nothing going on back there, but the building next door, the Pottery Barn. And now pretty soon, we're going to have Kmart, and we're going to have trucks back there. Why don't we just make a law that there is no overnight parking of commercial vehicles on the property?
We already have that, we need to define what overnight parking is, so that's the change that we have to make.
How about
You're
10 to
absolutely
6
right.
a.m.?
That's exactly, I was thinking 10 to 5, but.
Yeah.
10 to 6.
10 to 6, why don't we accomplish that, and then we've done something.
We've already talked about that today,
Okay.
so.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that fact, but I think that that's something that should be handled. And as far as all these boats and sizes and everything else that we've been talking about, I think that that's not a road that we need to cross right now. We need to get some definitions of what we want first. You can't tell somebody they can't have a motorhome this size when you can't even tell them what size driveway they're allowed to have. Correct? Sir, you had your hand up a minute. Is there something, or did we answer you?
I was just gonna say, there already are codes and regulations into the size of your property. You're only allowed to build X amount of percent of non-permeable surface. So the driveway, you have standards for a width, but could you concrete your entire front yard?
No,
Absolutely not.
cannot do that.
There's other
You
means.
can't even put all rock in your driveway either. You know, you gotta have a certain amount of grass. So I think this meeting has gone long enough, for this evening. So if, anyone has anything they would like to finish up with, or do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? I need a second? All in favor? Aye. Meeting adjourned. Wake up.
What happened?